She didn't tell anyone the exact day she was leaving. She just packed her life into 2 red suitcases, booked a one-way ticket out of Lowe's Angels, and decided that this time she wouldn't look back. For Sandra, the city had become a museum of memories, and every corner reminded her of something she didn't want to feel anymore. The sun was just beginning to rise when she stepped out of her apartment building for the last time, trench coat wrapped tight against the cool morning air. She paused at the sidewalk, staring at the empty street, half expecting someone to call her name, to ask why the woman who had always stayed for everyone else was finally walking away. No one did. The Uber slid up to the curb, the driver loaded her luggage, and Sandra slid into the back seat with the careful, quiet resolve of someone who had already cried all her tears the night before. As the car pulled away, the city rolled past her window like a film she'd already watched too many times. The cafe where she and Keanu had once spent hours talking about dreams they were both too scared to chase. The little bookstore on the corner that he'd called their place, after he found her there once, hiding in the poetry section after a bad audition. The cracked sidewalk where they'd argued, both of them too proud to admit that the real fight wasn't about the future, it was about fear. She let her eyes slide past these places, forcing her chest to stay calm, refusing to let her heart rewind to the night she told him she needed space, and he quietly believed her. Keanu had always been the quiet type, the one who listened more than he spoke, who offered kindness with a kind of humility that made you forget how much he was carrying himself. When Sandra walked away from him 3 months ago, he hadn't chased her. He just nodded, jaw tight, eyes wet but steady, and told her he wanted her to be happy, even if that meant he wasn't in the picture. She had taken that as proof that he didn't care enough. In truth, it was the only way he knew how to love, letting people go when they said they needed to leave. At the same time Sandra's car was turning onto the freeway, Keanu was in his small kitchen, staring at a mug of coffee he'd already forgotten he poured. He hadn't slept much. Something had been gnawing at him for days, a restless sense that he was about to lose something he didn't know how to fight for. He picked up his phone 3 times that week, typing out messages to her and deleting them before he hit send. He told himself she deserved peace, that she was better off without the storm of his doubts, his scars, his constant feeling of not being enough. That morning, though, an unfamiliar notification popped up on his cracked phone screen. It was from a mutual friend, a quick message, almost careless. "You said goodbye to Sandra yet? Just heard she's flying out today. One-way ticket. Guess she's finally done with this place." The words hit him so hard he had to grip the edge of the counter. One-way ticket, finally done. The friend had attached a blurry photo of Sandra posted on social media late last night, standing beside 2 red suitcases, smiling a little too bravely at the camera. Her caption was simple: "Time to start over." Keanu zoomed in on the picture until it blurred into pixels, his chest tightening. For months he'd tried to convince himself that what they had wasn't that deep, that the ache he felt when he thought of her would fade like every other goodbye he'd survived. But seeing her bags, seeing that determined set in her jaw that he knew meant she was hurting, shook something loose inside him. He realized that if she left the city now, everything unsaid between them would stay unsaid forever. The apologies, the gratitude. The confession that he'd been terrified of how much she mattered. His mind raced back to the last night they saw each other. She had stood in his doorway, eyes desperate and tired, telling him that the constant almost of their relationship was killing her. She wanted more than stolen evenings and half-spoken promises. She wanted someone who would choose her clearly and without fear. He had stayed silent too long, wrestling with ghosts that weren't hers to fight. When he finally opened his mouth, all he could manage was, maybe some time apart would be good. The look on her face when he said that had haunted him ever since. Now, with the faint hum of the fridge the only sound in the room, Keanu felt the sharp, unmistakable clarity that comes when you realize you are about to regret something for the rest of your life. He checked the time. 7:42 a.m. If she had an early flight, she might already be at the airport. The thought of her sitting alone at a gate, convincing herself that this was the only way to move on, made his chest burn with a mixture of anger at himself and fear. Fear that she would step onto that plane believing she wasn't worth fighting for. He set the coffee down, its surface still rippling from the tremor in his hand. Every part of him that was used to staying quiet, staying small, urged him to let her go with grace, to convince himself that fate would bring them together again if it was meant to be. But for the first time in a long time, he realized that calling something fate was sometimes just another way of refusing to be brave. This wasn't about destiny. This was about courage. About whether he could finally step beyond his own doubts long enough to show up for someone else. Without fully deciding, he was already moving, grabbing his keys, shoving his feet into worn sneakers, snatching his leather jacket from the back of the chair. His heart hammered as he locked the door behind him, a single thought drowning out all the others. If she boards that plane without hearing the truth, I'll never forgive myself. He jogged down the stairs 2 at a time, nearly colliding with an elderly neighbor carrying groceries. He stopped long enough to steady the man, apologize, and help him back to his door. Even in his panic, his instinct for kindness flickered through. It was who he was, and maybe that was why this moment mattered so much. Because for once, he had to extend that same kindness to himself and to her by not letting fear write the ending. By the time Keanu burst out onto the street, breath visible in the cool morning air, the city was waking up. Cars honked, buses rumbled past, people hurried by with coffee cups and headphones, oblivious to the quiet war raging inside the man standing on the curb. He opened his rideshare app with shaking hands, staring at the estimated arrival time to the airport, calculating and recalculating the minutes in his head. Traffic, security lines, boarding time. Every second felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He hit confirm ride and shoved his phone into his pocket, chest tight with a sudden, terrifying realization. He had no idea what he was going to say when he got there, only that if he didn't try, he would never again be the man he wanted to be. The car pulled up to the curb, the driver glancing at him through the open window and asking, "Airport?" Keanu nodded, swallowing hard as he climbed into the back seat, his pulse roaring in his ears as the driver pulled into traffic. While, at that very same moment, Sandra was stepping out of her Uber in front of the departure terminal, her fingers curling a little tighter around the handle of her red suitcase, completely unaware that someone had finally decided she was worth running after. Sandra's first step onto the curb outside the terminal felt heavier than it should have. The morning air smelled like exhaust and coffee, and for a moment she just stood there, fingers wrapped around the handle of her suitcase, staring up at the glass and steel of the airport. People flowed around her in a blur of rolling bags and hurried goodbyes. To them, this was routine. To her, it felt like stepping off a familiar cliff with no idea how far the fall would be. She drew in a slow breath, forcing her shoulders back, reminding herself that she had chosen this. Leaving wasn't an accident, it was survival. Inside, the terminal buzzed with announcements and the low murmur of voices. Sandra moved through it all like she was underwater, the sounds muffled, the colors slightly off. She checked the departures board, Flight 207 to New York on time, then followed the signs to security. With every step, a different memory tried to drag her back. Keanu laughing as they got lost downtown at midnight, his quiet voice telling her she was stronger than she thought. The way his hand had hesitated in midair that last night as if he wanted to reach for her but held back. She shook her head, annoyed at herself. "This is why you're leaving," she muttered under her breath. "You can't keep waiting for someone who won't choose you out loud." In the security line, she found herself behind a mother trying to juggle a toddler, a stroller, and a diaper bag. The little boy dropped his stuffed dinosaur, and without thinking, Sandra bent to pick it up, handing it back with a soft smile. The mother thanked her with tired eyes. It was such a small moment, but it hit Sandra like a quiet lesson. How easy it was to reach out, to help, to show up for someone, even for a heartbeat. Why had it felt so impossible for the one person she'd wanted most to simply say, "Don't go, stay, we'll figure it out together"? While Sandra shuffled her belongings into plastic bins and slipped off her shoes across the city, Keanu's rideshare was crawling through thick morning traffic. He watched the clock on the dashboard with a kind of controlled panic, his leg bouncing restlessly. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You catching a flight or meeting someone?" he asked casually. Keanu hesitated, then exhaled. "Trying to stop someone from leaving," he said, the words tasting strange and raw on his tongue. The driver gave a short, knowing chuckle. "Then you better hope we hit every green light, man." Keanu stared out the window at the blur of buildings, fighting the old familiar voice in his head that always told him he was too late, too flawed, too complicated to be anyone's safe choice. He thought about the way Sandra had looked at him the last time they spoke, hopeful, then hurt, then suddenly distant, like a door quietly closing. He told himself he was giving her space, respecting her wishes. But in the silence that followed, he'd realized it was fear dressed up as respect. Fear of promising more than he knew how to give. Fear of letting her see the vulnerable parts of him that didn't match the calm, steady man everyone assumed he was. The car jerked to a stop at a red light. A street performer on the corner was playing guitar, his open case on the ground, a few crumpled bills inside. Keanu watched as a businessman in an expensive suit rushed past without looking, then as a woman in a worn sweater doubled back to drop a single dollar into the case and offer the musician an encouraging smile. It struck him how kindness never really depended on how much you had to give. It depended on who you chose to be. He'd always tried to be kind to strangers, but with Sandra, the one person who had truly seen him, he'd hidden behind distance and caution. The realization stung. If love wasn't worth the risk of being fully seen, what was? Back at the airport, Sandra stepped through the metal detector, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with security protocols. When the agent waved her through without incident, she felt strangely disappointed, as if part of her had been hoping for some ridiculous delay, some sign from the universe that she wasn't meant to leave yet. Instead, everything was smooth, efficient, polite. The universe, it seemed, was staying out of this one. She found her gate and sank into an empty seat near the window, placing her red carry-on bag at her feet. Outside, planes moved slowly along the tarmac, heavy metal giants that somehow managed to rise into the sky as if gravity was just a suggestion. She wrapped her arms around herself and watched them, wondering if starting over in another city would really change anything inside her. What if she was the problem? What if no matter where she went, she'd still be the woman who gave too much of her heart to people who weren't ready to hold it? Her phone buzzed. For a split second, her heart leapt. Maybe it was him. Maybe he'd sent something simple like, "Is it really goodbye?" Or, "Can we talk?" Hands trembling slightly, she reached for the phone and turned it over. It was a notification from the airline confirming her boarding time. No missed calls, no messages from Keanu. The hope that had risen in her chest dissolved into a dull ache. She let the screen go dark, quietly scolding herself for expecting a grand gesture from a man whose greatest flaw was always underestimating how much his presence mattered. Meanwhile, the rideshare finally sped up as the freeway opened. Keanu leaned forward, gripping the back of the front seat as if that would somehow make the car move faster. "How much longer?" he asked. The driver checked the GPS. 10, maybe 12 minutes if traffic stays like this." Keanu ran a hand through his hair, mind racing through every version of the conversation he might have with Sandra. He imagined her angry, arms crossed, telling him he was too late. He imagined her quiet and distant, saying she'd already made up her mind. The hardest version to picture was the one where her eyes softened, where she let him explain, where she allowed the possibility that people could grow braver when they were given another chance. He thought about all the things that had shaped him: childhood losses, betrayals, the constant pressure to be strong, composed, unshakable. Those experiences had taught him resilience, but they had also taught him to keep his deepest feelings locked away where no one could hurt them. Sandra had been the first person who made him want to open that door. Her kindness had never been loud or showy. It was in the way she listened when he spoke about things that scared him, the way she redirected conversations when she sensed he was getting overwhelmed, the way she never made him feel small for needing time to process his emotions. And yet when she finally asked for clarity, for him to say out loud what they were and what he wanted, he had frozen. All that quiet courage she'd shown him, all that space she'd held, and when it was his turn to be brave, he had stepped back. Sitting in the back seat now, he realized that if he wanted to be worthy of the kind of woman who loved with that much honesty, he had to change. Not tomorrow, not someday. Now. At gate 24, Sandra watched a family reunite. A teenage girl came running down the hallway, flinging herself into the arms of an older woman who'd clearly been waiting a long time. They clung to each other, crying and laughing, oblivious to the crowd around them. Something twisted in Sandra's chest. It wasn't that she wanted a cinematic airport scene for herself. It was that she finally admitted how deeply she wanted someone to feel that way about her leaving. That sense of urgency. of "I can't let you go without at least trying." She glanced at the time on her phone, 35 minutes until boarding. She could still turn back, cancel the flight, call a cab, go home. But go home to what? To an empty apartment full of his echoes, to a city that knew every version of her except the one who finally chose herself. She swallowed hard, pushing the thought away. Leaving did mean she wasn't brave. It meant she was tired of waiting for another person to be. An announcement crackled over the speakers, calling passengers for a different flight. The sound made Sandra's heart jump anyway. She closed her eyes, took a steadying breath, and whispered a quiet, almost embarrassed prayer. "If I'm making a mistake, please just give me a sign." When she opened her eyes, nothing had changed. People checked their phones. Children argued over snacks. Somewhere, a suitcase wheel squeaked with every rotation. No sign, no miracle, just her and the decision she'd made. Outside, past layers of glass and security and concrete, a black sedan was finally pulling up to the departures level. Keanu threw a few bills onto the front seat before the car even came to a full stop, mumbling a rushed thank you as he shoved the door open. The cool air hit his face like a slap, but he barely noticed. He could see the terminal doors, the streams of travelers, the bright overhead signs. For the first time in a long time, he didn't calculate the odds or prepare himself for disappointment. He just ran. Heart pounding, lungs burning, he dodged rolling suitcases and weaving families, his eyes scanning every face, every coat, every flash of red luggage. Somewhere beyond those sliding glass doors, Sandra was sitting alone with a one-way ticket, trying to convince herself she wasn't worth chasing, as he, for the first time in his life, sprinted toward the chance to prove her wrong. Sandra's foot tapped restlessly against the airport floor, a nervous rhythm she couldn't quite control. The loudspeaker announced another flight, and for a moment she imagined her own being delayed, forcing her to sit a little longer with the quiet war going on inside her. Part of her wanted time to stretch, to give her more space to decide if she was really ready to let go of everything. Another part of her wished the boarding call would come quickly so she wouldn't have to feel any of this so sharply. She stared at the boarding pass in her hand, its glossy surface smudged by her thumb, and wondered when exactly she had started believing that starting over meant starting alone. She pulled out her phone again, not because she expected a message, but because the blank screen made her feel too exposed. Her notifications were ordinary: an airline alert, a discount offer from some app she never used, her friend's late-night text from the night before. "Proud of you for choosing yourself." She had read that message 3 times now, each time trying to absorb the compliment like a shield. But choosing herself didn't feel empowering in this moment. It felt like standing on a bridge she'd built with her own hands, about to burn it behind her just so she wouldn't be tempted to run back across. 2 gates away, a little girl suddenly burst into tears, refusing to get on a flight without her father, who was saying goodbye at the security checkpoint. Sandra watched as the man knelt and spoke to his daughter with patient, quiet love, explaining that he'd be there waiting when she came back. The child clung to him, resisting, until finally, reluctantly, she let her mother guide her toward the gate. The father stayed where he was, eyes glistening, watching his daughter until she disappeared from view. He didn't chase after her or demand she stay. He just stayed present fully until the very last possible second. Something about that broke open a tender place in Sandra's chest. Was it better to hold on until the last moment or to step away early so it hurt less? She genuinely didn't know anymore. Upstairs, just past the sliding glass doors, Keanu cleared the first set of security guards with a hurried explanation and a flash of his ID. He hadn't bought a ticket. He hadn't had time, so he knew he couldn't go past the actual checkpoint. That meant he had to find her before she entered the secure area, or he'd be left staring helplessly from behind a rope. His breathing was ragged, his palms slick with sweat as he scanned the departure screens, looking for any clue. There. Flight 207, New York, Terminal B, Gate 24. He memorized the numbers and took off down the corridor, weaving through crowds, his mind a storm of what-ifs. What if she was already at the gate? What if she'd turned off her phone? What if she saw him and walked the other way? The old Keanu would have let those questions talk him down, convincing him that trying would only embarrass him. But each doubt that rose up was met now with sharper clarity. You didn't come here for an outcome. You came here because not trying would break you. This wasn't some movie moment he was chasing. This was him refusing to let fear be the loudest voice in his life any longer. As he ran, he remembered a conversation they'd had months back, late at night, when neither of them could sleep. Sandra had told him that the bravest people she knew weren't the ones who never got hurt. They were the ones who were willing to show up again after they did. "Courage isn't loud," she'd said, lying beside him, staring at the ceiling. "Most of the time, it's just choosing to try one more time." He had listened, admired her for believing that, never imagining that one day those words would be the only thing pulling his feet forward in an airport hallway. Back at gate 24, the boarding sign changed. "On time, boarding in 15 minutes." Sandra exhaled slowly when she saw it, as if expecting to feel a sense of relief that this long, messy chapter of her life was finally closing. Instead, her eyes prickled with an ache she had promised herself she was done feeling. It wasn't that she wanted him to appear dramatically in front of her. In fact, part of her dreaded that possibility because it would complicate everything. But the silence, the finality of no message, no call, no sign at all, that cut in its own way. She wasn't angry, not really, just tired. Tired of caring more than the people she trusted to care back. She let her head rest against the cool glass, watching a plane lift off into the sky. As it rose, she thought of every time she'd watched someone she loved choose something else over her: work, pride, fear, distance. She had always found a way to justify it, to tell herself they were doing the best they could. Maybe they were, but somewhere along the journey she had stopped asking what she needed, what she wanted. Now, finally, she was forcing herself to answer. She wanted a life where she didn't shrink herself to accommodate someone else's fear. And right now, that meant walking through a gate and onto a plane, even if her knees felt weak doing it. A few corridors away, Keanu nearly collided with an airport employee pushing a cart. Sorry, he blurted, steadying the cart before sprinting on. He reached the security checkpoint and stopped short, chest heaving. This was the line he couldn't legally cross without a ticket. Beyond this barrier lay a maze of gates, one of which held the woman he'd spent months convincing himself he could learn to live without. He scanned the crowd desperately, hoping, praying for a glimpse of a beige trench coat or the flash of a red bag. Nothing, just strangers each caught in their own storms. Panic flickered at the edges of his thoughts. What if she'd already cleared security and was sitting at her gate, headphones in, miles away emotionally, even if she was only a short walk down the hall? A security officer stepped toward him. "Sir, you can't stand here," the man said firmly. "If you're not flying, you'll need to move along." Keanu swallowed, nodding, but his feet stayed planted. I'm waiting for someone. I need to see if she's." "Please, just give me a minute," he said, the plea in his voice surprising even himself. Maybe it was something in his eyes or the way his shoulders were set with a mix of determination and fear, but the officer paused. "What's her name?" he asked, almost gently. Keanu blinked. "Sandra," he said quietly. "She's leaving today, and I didn't tell her what I should have told her a long time ago." The officer studied him, then exhaled, his expression softening a fraction. "I can't let you through," he said, "but you can wait off to the side of the line just for a bit. If she hasn't gone through yet, you might catch her." It was a small kindness, but in that moment it felt enormous. Keanu nodded, gratitude tightening his throat, and moved where the officer indicated, his eyes scanning every new wave of travelers who approached. Time seemed to thicken, every second stretching into an eternity. He watched faces, coats, bags, searching for anything familiar. Each moment that passed without seeing her made the possibility of losing her more real. But under the fear, something else was growing, a thin, stubborn thread of resolve. If he missed her here, he told himself, it still wouldn't be the end. He would get on the next flight, show up in whatever city she landed in, and take responsibility for being late to his own life. He would not go back to the version of himself who believed that staying silent was a form of protection. At the gate, the final pre-boarding announcement rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin boarding Flight 207 to New York shortly. Please have your boarding passes and identification ready." Sandra straightened in her seat, fingers locking around the handle of her carry-on. The words hit her like a date being carved into stone. She looked down at her phone one last time, almost against her will, still nothing. The quiet truth settled over her like a heavy coat. Sometimes the people we want a sign from are fighting battles we can't see, or they're just not ready to be who we need them to be. Either way, she couldn't keep freezing her life waiting. She stood, knees unsteady, and joined the forming line. Around her, people chatted, adjusted bags, checked their tickets. She felt strangely alone in the crowd, like a ghost moving alongside the living. As the line inched forward, her breath grew shallow. Was this bravery, or was it just escape with better branding? A memory surfaced, Keanu listening to her talk about a failed audition, telling her softly, "You didn't fail. You just learned something you didn't know yesterday." Back then, he'd believed in her more than she believed in herself. The irony that she now had to believe in herself more than he believed in them wasn't lost on her. The line moved again. Only a few passengers stood between her and the gate agent now. Her heart hammered so loudly she could barely hear the announcements anymore. She stared at the open jet bridge beyond the podium, the metal tunnel that would take her to a new life. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "Step forward, don't look back." Yet even as she said it, some fragile, stubborn part of her still held space for an impossible image. A familiar voice calling her name over the noise, footsteps running toward her, not away. At the security barrier, just as Keanu's hope began to fray, a small boy dropped a stuffed animal near the front of the line. The toy rolled toward him, stopping at his feet. He bent to pick it up, and as he straightened, his eyes caught on something moving through the cordoned path, a flash of long brown hair, a beige coat, and a deep red shoulder bag. His breath caught. It was her. From behind, from a distance, he would have known her anywhere. She was only a few steps from the metal detector. For a heartbeat, everything went quiet in his mind. The crowds, the announcements, the officer's watchful gaze. All that remained was the shape of her shoulders, slightly hunched as if bracing herself against the weight of her own decision. He clutched the stuffed toy and for the first time in his life didn't think about whether what he was about to do would look foolish, desperate, or too much. He stepped forward, heart in his throat, opened his mouth to call her name. And in that exact moment, she placed her phone in the tray, stepped through the metal detector, and disappeared into the secure side of the terminal, leaving him with only a few feet of empty air, a plastic bin, and the question of whether he was, once again, just a little too late. Sandra adjusted the strap of her bag on the other side of security, unaware that just a few meters away, behind a metal barrier, Keanu was standing frozen with a child's stuffed toy in his hand, and her name caught in his throat. For a moment, she felt a strange shiver crawl up her spine, the way you feel when someone is looking for you in a crowd. But when she turned, all she saw were strangers collecting shoes and laptops. She shook it off and followed the herd of passengers toward the maze of gates, convincing herself that the hollow feeling in her chest was just nerves about the move. Back at the checkpoint, the little boy's mother called out, "His dinosaur, please," snapping Keanu out of his trance. He blinked, handed the toy back with an absent "Here you go, buddy," and then whipped his head toward the security officer. "She just went through," he said, voice rough. "Brown hair, beige coat, red bag. Please, there has to be some way I can reach her." The officer's expression softened, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry. Once a passenger is past this point, you can't follow without a ticket." Keanu's stomach dropped. The rules were logical, but his heart didn't care about logic. "Then I'll buy one," he said quickly. "For her flight, for any flight. I can't let her leave thinking she didn't matter." He sprinted to the nearest airline counter, nearly skidding as he turned. The agent looked up, startled by the urgency in his eyes. "Next available ticket to New York," he said, trying to catch his breath. "Whatever it costs, please." As she tapped at her keyboard, he stared at the clock on the wall with a desperate intensity. Every minute felt like another layer of distance between them. The agent frowned slightly at the screen. "There's a seat," she said, "but boarding has already started." "You'll be cutting it very close." He nodded without hesitation. "Book it." He didn't care if he ended up in the last row by the bathroom. He didn't care if he had to sprint barefoot down the jet bridge. All he cared about was not surrendering to the version of himself who always arrived a moment too late and called it fate. Across the terminal, Sandra reached gate 24 and saw the last group beginning to board. Her heart panged, a quiet final warning that once she stepped through, this chapter would truly close. She hesitated at the back of the line, fingers brushing over her phone one last time. She almost typed his name, almost sent a simple message, "I'm boarding now," just to release the last thin thread between them. But she stopped. If he had wanted to say something, he'd had months. She wouldn't beg the universe for a sign from someone who'd chosen silence. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and took a slow step forward. Behind her, through layers of glass, crowds, and timing just a shade off, Keanu grabbed his printed ticket and took off toward the gates. lungs burning, heart pounding. He didn't know if he would reach her before the plane doors closed. He didn't know if she would listen if he did. All he knew was that, for the first time, he was running not from his fear, but straight through it, toward the one person who had always believed there was more courage in him than he could see in himself. And as Sandra handed her boarding pass to the agent, she felt that same strange shiver again, a faint sense that a choice bigger than she understood was happening somewhere just out of sight, in the seconds before her foot crossed onto the jet bridge.